After Hitler ordered the German tank divisions to halt their advance for 48 hours in front of Dunkirk, the British Navy was able to evacuate around 338,000 Allied and English soldiers from the French coast to the island from May 25th to 4th of June 1940. The topic of this video is how the German Luftwaffe was now supposed to prevent the loading and transport, and thus bring about the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force. However, the Luftwaffe was never able to do this, since in the past, it had mainly been built up as aerial artillery to support the army, and it had been prepared neither for strategic operations through bombing raids nor for a war against shipping. It was true that the Junkers 87s were used as ground support aircraft. The dive bombers, or Stukas as they were called, had at least managed to keep the convoys away from the Channel and the North Sea after the British evacuation operation. But the twin-engine bombers had been just as unable to monitor the operational supply routes along the British west coast. Nor had they been able to carry out massive airstrikes against the ports located on the River Mersey, such as Liverpool, or against Glasgow with its shipyards, because the fighters of the Royal Air Force had repeatedly blocked their way there. And for night attacks on these distant targets, the Luftwaffe still lacked appropriately trained personnel for the time being, as well as the technical equipment essential for such attacks. Regardless of that, however, Hitler needed to defeat the British enemy, or even better, reach an agreement with Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in order to free his hands for a possible attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. However, since London repeatedly rejected any kind of understanding with Berlin, the only alternative left was the invasion of Great Britain. On the 2nd of July, the Chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, Colonel General Wilhelm Keitel, issued a preliminary directive for a landing in England, but with the explicit reservation ordered by the Anglophile Hitler. All initial work must consider this: that the plan to land in England has by no means taken definite shape yet, and that it is only a preparation for a possible case. However, the Wehrmacht leadership only began to consider the idea of a landing from August 1, 1939, and even then, only in a rather theoretical way. Only the staff of the Naval High Command and Vice Admiral Otto Schneewind had been dealing with the problems of such an operation since November 1939. However, this was done without orders from above and virtually in secret. But it seems the motivation for this was more about providing the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who was not in favor of an invasion of England for military reasons, with solid information to support his rejection in case Hitler wanted him to present an invasion plan. When he actually had to present the possibilities of a landing to Hitler on the 11th of July, he was able to support his view, equipped with plenty of arguments that no landing fleet would survive. Not until the Luftwaffe had first destroyed the Royal Air Force and second, driven the British naval forces out of the Channel. Hitler, who had little maritime knowledge and was not a supporter of a landing himself, had agreed with Raeder. In any case, a landing would only be considered as a last resort in order to, quote, make England willing to make peace. The Army High Command and Colonel General Walter von Brauchitsch on the left, who, according to tradition and training, thought of war in terms of land operations and had no experience with amphibious operations of this scale, had also fully agreed with the Navy's view. The Army was simply afraid of all the possible uncertainties of an invasion across the sea, and just how great the lack of knowledge about it was. The enormous organizational efforts that a landing operation of this scale, over water, onto heavily defended enemy territory would require, were shown by the diary entry of the Chief of the Army General Staff, Colonel General Franz Halder, on July 3rd. For him, such a procedure was similar to that of a major river crossing along the Ostend-le Havre route. I just mentioned that Hitler was also not a supporter of an invasion of the British Isles. But since Churchill, in the center of the picture, continued to stubbornly refuse to negotiate with him in any way, Hitler had to force Great Britain to surrender for his further plans. To avoid a dreaded two-front war, he issued Directive Number 16 on July 16. Since England, despite its militarily hopeless situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to an understanding, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, to carry it out. The purpose of this operation is to eliminate the English homeland as a base for continuing the war against Germany and, if necessary, to occupy it completely. It was remarkable that Adolf Hitler, both when mentioning the landing operation and the possible occupation, once again qualified military actions against Great Britain with the additions, if necessary, and if it should become required. As he had emphasized several times, he by no means wanted to strike so hard that the British Empire would collapse as a result. Furthermore, the directive contained the following. To this end, I order the following. First, the landing must take place in the form of a surprise crossing, broadly from Ramsgate to the area west of the Isle of Wight. The preparations must be completed by mid-August. Second, these preparations also include creating the conditions necessary to make a landing in England possible. The English Air Force must be fought down both morally and actually to such an extent that it no longer poses any significant offensive power against the German crossing. Mine-free paths must be created. A dense mine barrier must block the Strait of Dover on both flanks, as well as the western entrance to the channel, roughly along the Eldore-Portland line. The coastal approaches must be controlled and coordinated by strong coastal artillery. The operation is codenamed Seelöwe. When Hitler issued this directive, 6 weeks had already passed since the Allied armies fled from France to England. But even now, he was still unsure about the next step and how to proceed in relations with Great Britain. This was once again proven by his actions on 19th July, when he gave his carrot and stick speech before the Reichstag, in which he appealed to what he called England's reason. Otherwise, it would be destroyed. He had made a determined and sincere effort to gain the friendship of the British Empire, a world power that he never intended to destroy or even harm. However, he was fully aware that continuing this fight would only end with the complete destruction of one of the two combatants, and he concluded with the following words. Mr. Churchill may believe that it will be Germany. I know it will be England. In his diary, the not particularly German-friendly foreign minister of Allied Italy, Count Romeo Ciano, who was an honorary guest at the Kroll Opera, recorded his impression that evening. I believe that he is sincere in his desire for peace. Indeed, now in the late evening, as the first signs of the cold British reaction to the speech become known, a poorly concealed feeling of disappointment is spreading. This was also confirmed during Ciano's visit to Hitler the next day. He would like to come to an understanding with Great Britain. He knows that the war with the English will be hard and bloody. Now, once again, Germany's policy took its toll, especially in 1938 against the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was committed to peace and reconciliation. His willingness to give in had been interpreted by Hitler and the National Socialist Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who compensated for his lack of qualification with arrogance as a weakness of the empire. Ribbentrop was the one who firmly believed that neither France nor Great Britain would declare war on Germany because of the attack on Poland. Just one of dozens of misjudgments by the German foreign minister, about whom his longtime state secretary Ernst von Weizsäcker had said. The mistake lay in the system itself, which made it possible for someone like him to become foreign minister, and, in that capacity, to serve a nation of 70 million people for 7 years. Days after Hitler's speech, the Reich Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, had the Reichstag speech printed in a 4-page newspaper and dropped en masse as leaflets from great heights over Great Britain. However, the British had dealt with this matter with their own black humor. The collected leaflets were auctioned off as curiosities, with the proceeds going to the British Red Cross. Once again, Hitler had to realize that he was facing an opponent in Winston Churchill who remained unimpressed and stuck to his course. Also considering that the United Kingdom accounted for a quarter of the world's population, 450 million people, and a fifth of the landmass. Furthermore, Churchill could already count on the help of the United States at this point. For example, on 15th of May 1940, the British Prime Minister had already proposed to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt a so-called Destroyers for Bases agreement, according to which 50 U.S. Navy destroyers would be handed over in exchange for rights to bases on Commonwealth territory. On the 31st of July, Churchill followed up again with a letter to Roosevelt. If we get through the next 3 to 4 months, I look to the course of the war with considerable optimism. We're holding our own in the air, but the loss of destroyers to bombing raids could easily become so serious that the defense of our supply lines across the Atlantic could collapse. I trust that they will do everything they can for the immediate transfer of their 50 to 60 oldest destroyers. The U.S. Navy was involved at the time, but the delivery of the destroyers was not in line with the status of the United States as a neutral country at that time, as agreed by the Articles 6 and 8 of the agreement from the 18th October 1907, during at the Second Hague Peace Conference regarding the rights and duties of neutrals in the event of a naval war. A belligerent power, for any reason, directly or indirectly caused the delivery of warships, ammunition, and for any reason, warships, ammunition, and Navy, the warships, and Article 8. A neutral government is obliged to use the means at its disposal to prevent, within its jurisdiction, the outfitting or arming of any ship for which it has reasonable grounds to believe that it is intended to cruise or take part in hostile operations against a power with which it is at peace. It is also obliged to exercise the same supervision to prevent any ship intended to cruise or take part in hostile operations from leaving its jurisdiction that has been wholly or partly fitted out for war within its jurisdiction. From an international law perspective, the German Reich could therefore have used this incident as a proven case as a justification for a declaration of war. In any case, after the Reichstag speech on the 19th, Churchill's cabinet had again rejected the request in July. As a result, Hitler now tried to make up for the many lost weeks he had spent in his Anglophile optimism. For this, on the 21st of July, he summoned the commanders-in-chief of the Wehrmacht branches and informed them that, despite the favorable situation, every effort should be made to end the war as soon as possible, for which the most effective means would be the execution of Operation Seelöwe. However, this operation is an extraordinarily bold and daring undertaking, and furthermore, it is not a one-time crossing operation like in Norway. An operational surprise cannot be expected. A defense-ready and utterly determined opponent who was moved by the situation was present. Admittedly, it was certainly not a coincidence that, for him, a surprise attack across the Channel had become an illusion by now, even if that was the case on the 16th of July, with the introduction of Directive Number 16. The landing must take place in the form of a surprise crossing on a broad front, roughly from Ramsgate to the area west of the island. He had also insisted that, due to the approaching bad weather period, the main operation had to be completed by 15th of September, and he emphasized once again that, for him, complete air superiority was the only prerequisite for an invasion. And furthermore, since the involvement of the Air Force is crucial, the greatest consideration must be given to them when setting the date. If the preparations cannot be completed by the beginning of September, other plans would have to be considered. However, since by that time hardly any serious preparations for Seelöwe had actually been undertaken, one could also infer from these strict demands that Hitler had given little chance to a successful landing operation on the British Isles. Regardless of this, Grand Admiral Raeder had now given the order together with Hermann Göring to intensify the measures for mobilizing the Western European shipping space. This meant that all work on building warships was interrupted, as well as work on the submarines. And every shipyard from Digne, which was called Gotenhafen from 1939 to 1945, to the French Cherbourg was requisitioned, since there was no time to build special landing ships in sufficient numbers, like the ones the Allies had for their Asian or European landing operations, for example. Here, on the 6th of June 1944 in Normandy, the Kriegsmarine had requisitioned river barges, motorboats, tugs, and coastal vessels and converted them. Also, under the direction of Friedrich Siebel, seen on the left in the picture, a number of makeshift landing craft were built, the so-called Siebel ferries. By the end of the war, around 200 of them existed. The naval staff had estimated that, to meet the Army's minimum transport needs, 471 tugs, 1,722 barges, 1,161 motorboats, and 155 transport ships would be required. But whether such a fleet could be assembled and manned in time and could wait was anything but certain. Because according to estimates by the Navy, a minimum of 20,000 additionally trained soldiers was required to use the barges as landing craft. But by August 1940, there were still 4,000 men missing. The deeper the naval staff delved into the subject, here on the right in the picture, at a meeting with the Italian Naval General Staff in Murano, the more it literally made their hair stand on end. On the 19th of July, the staff presented the results to Grand Admiral Raeder, which basically gave little chance for a landing. The task assigned to the Navy as part of Operation Seelöwe is out of all proportion to its capabilities. The transport routes pass through a sea area where weather conditions, fog currents, tides, and sea state can cause the greatest difficulties, especially since the landing during the strong defense of the enemy ports must take place at least for the first wave on the open coast. Even if the ports could be captured soon, they would certainly be mined and blocked. The coastal waters are already mined, and clearing them cannot begin until the English fleet has been driven out of the channel. It cannot be expected that the Luftwaffe alone will succeed in keeping the enemy naval forces away from the transport routes, especially given the Luftwaffe's strong dependence on weather conditions. Therefore, the possibility must be considered that the enemy, even if the transfer of the first transport wave has succeeded, may still be able to insert naval forces, determined to the utmost, between the first wave landed on the enemy coast and the following transports. But the fundamentally negative assessment by the naval staff was not all because the biggest problem had yet to arise. The demands of the Army General Staff under Colonel General Halder regarding the strength and width of the landing had yet to be addressed. The Army's demands for the first wave were at least 13 divisions and a front over 320 kilometers wide, from Ramsgate to Weymouth and to Lyme Bay. These forces would have to gain a foothold on the coast within 2 to 3 days and be able to transition to land operations. If that couldn't be achieved, the attacking divisions would be pinned down in their bridgeheads. As a result, the Operations Department of the Naval Command had determined that securing transport over such a vast expanse of sea was impossible. Only securing the Strait of Dover between Folkestone and Eastbourne was possible. Furthermore, the Navy made it clear that it would indeed be possible to provide enough transport space for the first wave of 90,000 men and 650 tanks as planned by the Army. However, it would not be possible to provide shipping space for the second assault wave of 170,000 men, 34,000 vehicles, and 57,000 horses at the same time. This second wave could only be transported across in 4 to 5 groups at intervals of 2 to 3 days. But this Navy proposal to land only in a narrow area was now again sharply rejected by General Wolfsburg and Colonel Halder, who described it from the Army's point of view as pure suicide. But Vice Admiral Otto Schneewind, Chief of Staff of the Naval War Command, seen here at an awards ceremony, stuck to his position, that any attempt to land on a broad front would result in the sacrifice of the very first assault wave, even before it reached the coast. It was precisely these completely divergent views of the representatives of the Army and the Navy that had most clearly revealed the dilemma. If the Army's demand for a crossing on a broad front were enforced, with the Royal Navy's strength unbroken and the Royal Air Force not yet defeated, the destruction of the landing fleet at sea would be almost certain. On the other hand, it was also understandable that the Army would have little chance of success on land if it attacked on only a narrow front. So, the last hope remained that the Luftwaffe would succeed in gaining air superiority in the foreseeable future, and thus paralyze the British sea and land defenses through bombing raids. When Grand Admiral Raeder gave Hitler once again a lecture on the planned operation on July the 31st, he again pointed out the paramount importance of air superiority. He had also reported that the naval preparations were indeed in full swing, but would not be completed before September 15th, and that this deadline could only be met if the Air Force had achieved air superiority by the end of August. Only then would it be possible to land on schedule, since at the end of September and in the first half of October, the weather is generally good, and the favorable moon and tide periods are between the 19th and the 26th of September. But, taking all circumstances into account, Grand Admiral Raeder had also recommended that the best time for the operation would be the coming May. However, Hitler had continued to insist on the deadline of 15th of September and added that an attempt should be made in any case. But this time, he also qualified his statement again, saying that a decision about the invasion in September or later would only be made after the Luftwaffe had carried out a concentrated attack on southern England for a week. If the enemy airfields and naval forces were severely damaged afterwards, Operation Seelöwe was to be carried out in 1940. Otherwise, it would be postponed to May 1941. The result of Raeder's presentation was Directive Number 17 for the conduct of the air and naval war against England, issued on 1st of August 1940. It declared that the air and naval war against the English homeland was to be continued more intensively than before in order to create the conditions for the final defeat of England. The German Air Force is to defeat the English Air Force as quickly as possible with all available forces. After achieving temporary or local air superiority, the air war against the ports is to be continued. With this, both the Army and the Navy managed to shift sole responsibility to the Air Force for creating the conditions necessary for an invasion of the British Isles. It was now supposed to make the impossible possible, while compensating for Germany's obvious weakness at sea. It was meant to secure both naval and air supremacy, and it was claimed that, in the absence of heavy German naval artillery, it should neutralize the English coastal defenses and directly support the German assault units until the Navy, tanks, and heavy artillery could land in sufficient numbers. and it was supposed to provide transport squadrons for auxiliary transports to compensate for the slowness of resupply by sea, which could only be managed through repeated crossings. Finally, during the critical phase of the initial battles, the Luftwaffe was supposed to provide transport for airborne troops, who would then be used to disrupt southern England's road and rail traffic. In order to prevent the deployment of British reserves, it is now assumed that all the requirements for an invasion would actually have been met. However, one can also vividly imagine how the operation would have turned out. Because, as with all other German military operations before and after, the British defense at the manor house of Bletchley Park, 70 kilometers northwest of London, was also fully informed about Operation Seelöwe, thanks to the deciphering of the German Enigma machine. It was not until 1974 that the British Royal Air Force Group Captain, equivalent to a colonel, the intelligence officer Frederick William Winterbottom, was not exiled. With Miss Sophie in his book, The Ultra Secret, in 1976 German edition, Operation Ultra, he revealed the secret and made an accurate observation. Once all the British secret documents are available, history will judge quite a few generals of the Second World War differently, because they had all been inspired by the extensive findings of the British intelligence operation Ultra, which, in principle, had deciphered everything that came from the Führer headquarters or the command staffs of the branches of the Wehrmacht. Behind it were orders and instructions, German operational intentions, strengths and weaknesses of deployed units, deployment of divisions, command structures, leadership personnel, and so on. For Operation Seelöwe, Group Captain Winterbottom intercepted all Luftwaffe radio messages starting from the 1st of August and decrypted and learned them. Before invading, the Luftwaffe was to destroy England's air defenses first. And after Germany lost the Battle of Britain on the morning of the 5th of September, a command from Göring was deciphered at Bletchley Park. The British defense specialists knew that 300 bombers from Luftflotte 3 were supposed to destroy the London docks, and that Operation Seelöwe was replaced by heavy bombardments. It would no longer take place. This map shows fictional planned British defensive measures against an attack on the 22nd of September, 1940. It marked a German invasion to defend against what was called the Invasion Corner. And on the south coast of England, the British Army had stationed 16 divisions. They were not yet fully armed, but they were still equipped well enough that they could have put up fierce resistance. The biggest shortage was in anti-tank guns, but the shortage of tanks had been overcome because since Dunkirk, the industry had delivered 350 new tanks, like the Mark VI Crusader here. That meant that the British Army now had more than 800 combat vehicles. In contrast, the Wehrmacht had, according to the diary of Colonel General Holder, just 42 Panzer IVs and 168 Panzer IIIs by late August, which were scheduled for landing. Although this obvious resurgence of the British land forces had become a problem for Hitler, he had relied on the assurances of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The Luftwaffe would be able to keep the Royal Air Force away from the Channel. Therefore, efforts were intensified once again, and a mediation offer from the Swedish King Gustav V was rejected. After Hitler then approved the Navy's plan for a landing at a narrow front on the 19th, Gerd von Rundstedt was promoted to General Field Marshal to lead the operation of the Army Group Command A. The first command for the execution of Operation Seelöwe essentially looked like this. The task of the Army is, with the support of the Navy and Air Force, to land strong forces in southern England and defeat the English Army, to occupy London and, depending on the situation, other areas of England as well. The execution of the task assigned to the Army is the responsibility of Army Group Command A with the subordinate 16th and 9th Army. The task of Army Group A is initially to capture the English south coast between Folkestone and Worthing, and then to establish control over a broad, continuous bridgehead about 20 to 30 kilometers deep. After the arrival of further reinforcements, the Army Group will launch a coordinated attack, and to secure the line from the Thames estuary south of London to Portsmouth as the first operational objective. Advance fast forces west of London, encircle the capital from the south and west at first, and then report the attack once the line has been secured. Continue north and northeast of London to the Severn estuary as the second operational objective. The task of the 16th Army is to launch from the Rotterdam-Calais line and land at the mouth of the Thames on the English coast in the Folkestone-St. Leonard's sector, including to force and initially to gain a broad bridgehead along the line Canterbury, course of the Great Stour, Ashford, Tenterden, Etchingham. The task of the 9th Army is to simultaneously advance with the 16th. The Army, advancing from the Boulogne-Le Havre line, is to capture the English coast between Bexhill and Worthing, and then, together with the 16th Army, to advance initially up to the line Hadlow Down, Burgess Hill, Storrington, and westward. It is to be expected that the attack from the bridgehead line to achieve the first operational objective cannot take place before the 8th day after the initial landing. But when Hitler gave the order to launch the air offensive through the Luftwaffe at the beginning of August, they were still in the middle of preparations. If Operation Seelöwe actually occurred in the third week of September, as it had been tentatively scheduled, no more time should have been lost now. But it wasn't until the 6th of August that Goering summoned his commanders for a final discussion of the plans at Carron Hall, where he announced favorable weather, provided that the first strike was to be carried out on 13th of August, the so-called Eagle Day. The air battle over England lasted with varying intensity from 10th of July to the 31st of October, 1940, and ended with a clear defeat of the Luftwaffe. This was due in part to the English decoding of German orders through Ultra and the efficient radar-based British fighter control system. Also due to serious mistakes by the Luftwaffe leadership, the lack of strategic bombers and long-range escort fighters, poor operational tactics, and insufficient intelligence work. During the Battle of Britain on 10th of September, Hitler once again postponed his decision to launch the invasion by 3 days. But during those 72 hours, the situation for Germany had significantly worsened, and not just in the air, but now also on the water, because when the British leadership issued the code word Cromwell on Saturday, the 7th September, at 8 p.m., the keyword for the imminent invasion, the Royal Navy and Bomber Command, had intensified their prepared countermeasures and had become active. Thus, on the 12th of September, the Naval Group West reported from Paris to Berlin that enemy air forces, long-range artillery, and light naval forces had intervened more significantly in the fighting. So, the talks from Ostend, Dunkirk, Calais, and here in Boulogne. Because of the danger of air raids and artillery fire, the anchorages intended for the invasion transport ships would have to be closed at night. This would allow the units of the British fleet to operate in the channel undisturbed. Further delays due to these measures could be expected. Grand Admiral Raeder had foreseen this on the 14th September during a meeting between Hitler and the commanders-in-chief and chiefs of staff of the 3 branches of the Wehrmacht. In response, Hitler once again declared that the operation would truly only be used as a last resort, since the required level of air superiority had not yet been achieved. However, he believed that British resistance might still be broken, if, in addition to further air attacks, the pressure of the threat of invasion remained. The result of the meeting on 14th of September was that the decision about an invasion was once again postponed for another 3 days. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was to make another attempt to destroy the Royal Air Force in the battle over London. But by then, the Royal Air Force had recovered, and on the 16th September, they even attacked the transport ships lying in the French Channel ports. On the morning of the 17th, 12% of the transport fleet had either been sunk or damaged. This confirmed the already skeptical naval command, what would threaten an invasion fleet on the high seas without air superiority. The War Diary of the German Naval Staff notes on the 17th, "Enemy air force has by no means been defeated. On the contrary, it is showing increasing activity. The general weather situation does not suggest a calming toward a longer period of high pressure. The Führer therefore decides to postpone Operation Seelöwe indefinitely." 2 days later, on the 19th of September 1940, on Hitler's orders, the large invasion fleet was dispersed to less vulnerable coastal areas without having taken the slightest action against Great Britain during all those past weeks. Operation Seelöwe was finally off the table and was no longer taken seriously by the British, and on the German side, it was only used as a verbal threat.